Welcome to The Incredible Messenger, a blend of real-world stories, expert insights, and proven strategies that keep our families, communities, and cities safe and healthy. Moving beyond rhetoric and politics to practical solutions and community safety, here's your host, Jonathan McMillan.
Hey, welcome back to the Incredible Messenger podcast. I am your host, Jonathan McMillan, and boy, y'all are going to get tired of me saying this in every intro. I'm really excited about the guest who's on the show today. I feel like this is my kindred spirit. She's a counterpart. She's a colleague. She's inspirational. She's a leader in the space. I feel supported because I know I haven't been by myself in these spaces, and we've had a lot of shared experiences from hundreds of miles that separate us and has brought us together in this space. I think that this is going to be just a really powerful, valuable, beneficial conversation. When I was in the roles of the director of violence prevention, the pathway to get there was through what my first guest on the show, Anthony Smith in the city of Louisville, Kentucky. He was essentially what I would say maybe the prototype for how I wanted to operate and move as a director of that level of work. That being said, Anthony left that role, eventually went on to become the executive director of an organization called Cities United. The work has continued to grow and scale, and the impact that it's had on the city of Louisville was amazing because after Anthony, I don't know if it was immediately after Anthony or not, but my next guest, Monique Dr. Williams, I want to give you all that respect. You're welcome. Do you mind if I call you Monique? Because
that's fine.
All right. So, yeah, spoiler alert, it's Dr. Monique Williams. Monique, who eventually came in to lead the Office of Neighborhood Safety and Engagement. And in that role, we have shared many perspectives, experiences, and we're going to talk about some, if not all of that today. Monique, welcome to the show.
Excited to be here.
I am as well. You know, I'm very intentional about who I bring onto the show because my goal is threefold, but I'll just start with one of those, is to let people know if they are thinking about starting an office of violence prevention, neighborhood safety and engagement, or youth violence prevention, or whatever you want to call it, what does that look like? And what is necessary in order to be successful? I think at the top of the list is who leads that office, who helps move the work forward. And obviously you were one of those people and the right person. So I want my audience to learn more about you. Like, who is Monique and what got you on this path? And then we'll talk a little bit more about what you're doing now and get into that.
Sure. So, I mean, from a personal standpoint, right? Like what has me kind of interested in this workspace is how I grew up in my own community and growing up with certain things that were normalized that probably shouldn't be. The way you experience gun violence and loss or trauma, the normalized patterns that come along with trauma, becoming an adult and realizing like, oh, this stuff is not normal. Oh, these are things that young people should necessarily be exposed to. Just because of the maternal nature of the women that I was around in community, there was always a communal response of like women organizing to heal or bring together community whenever anything happened, good or bad. And so my mindset has always been, what can I do to create an environment that young people growing up the way that I did don't necessarily have to experience the things that I experienced. A place that is probably better for their social and emotional health and well-being. And forever, I thought that meant becoming a pediatrician so I could see children and do all these things. But obviously, life has taken me down a different path of getting here. But my personal conviction is wanting to create better environments than the one that I grew up in. On the professional side, it did start with me pursuing medicine and then shifting a medicine focus to a public health focus. And that's where I feel like I found everything that I loved, right? Learning about program development and improving health outcomes and how to develop interventions and know whether or not your intervention was effective. Everything in public health focuses on populations on the margin of whatever the issue is. And so that type of science really kind of made my wheels turn. And so then I ended up focusing in community health sciences and the science of working in community. And my degrees kind of flew in that same direction, right? So my undergrad degree is public health, my master's degree is public health, and my PhD is public health. And all, again, were grounded in social and behavioral health promotion, and building the health of communities. And I really probably align myself a lot with processes, like the process of working in community, the process of doing things in ways that heal rather than harm. But from the academic perspective and research perspective, which is where I lived for a long time. And so I started as a graduate research assistant working for a CDC-funded center at Texas A&M University, where I was working with rural communities in Texas, with marginalized communities, to help them develop sustainable strategies for health improvement. And I mean, that ran the gamut, right? Whether we were talking about diabetes or access to physical activity, heart disease, whatever the health issue was. And then, though, in those spaces, kind of this nuanced area of violence was there, though it wasn't talked about in that way. But the systematic kinds of things that are experienced by individuals who have been marginalized and how that even further impacts their health. And so while you're dealing with the actual kind of health issue, you're having to deal with like the barriers that are there from, right, the intentional kind of discrimination and experiences that folks are having, and then recognizing that there has to be strategy for that too. And so in doing that work, I was recruited to the University of Louisville to kind of build out the same type of environment, right? Like, how do you help to bring university resources to bear on health issues? And in Louisville, right, it was like, hey, that area over there, that West Louisville, the area where, the health outcomes are the worst, the violence is the highest, whatever is like wrong health-wise, you could probably find over there. So it's like, help us improve health outcomes over there. Okay, got it. The science of working in community, building relationships, and then bringing those university resources to bear on those community issues. And that's actually where I met Anthony when he was working for the city, and I'm in the university, and now I'm helping him kind of figure out how to establish whatever the strategy is for the city. But from my perspective of how do we build evaluation? How do we bring resources? How do we write grants, right? How do we facilitate processes in community to help coordinate some of this work? And so that is the work that I did there that kind of got me into the violence prevention space there. But it also became the thing that I researched and began to learn more about. And so as I was getting my PhD there and studying the 3 violence typologies, so looking at cultural violence, structural violence, and direct violence, and how all of those things are connected, what are the kinds of strategies that need to be put in place for the reduction of violence by addressing all of those things? And then we ended up with a designation from the CDC through a grant that we wrote. I became the director of that center. We were designated as a National Center of Excellence in Youth Violence Prevention. And we were one of 5 centers at the time with that designation from the CDC to help move us forward in what we understood about youth violence. Our lens on that was very different because you can't unsee what you know. And if you recognize certain things as root causes, then your strategies are going to be built from that space. And so we really focused on the element of structural violence and bringing awareness of the connectivity between structural violence, cultural violence, and the outcome of youth violence, and getting young people who were impacted by violence engaged in that process, engaged in that understanding, and then leading the charge of what the messaging needed to be around what needed to be done about violence and young people experiencing violence based on what they were learning in that capacity. I did that work for a while, which is always, again, a mixture of research, but practice, because I don't know how not to be in the practice lane. I don't know how not to actually do the work. I was intentional about ensuring that the office that we had was not on the university campus. It was in the neighborhood, right? So that people had access to us. And so you build all kind of relationships that way, being in the community with the folks. From there, 2020 happened, the pandemic, everything's going crazy. Breonna Taylor happens in our city. Our city is on fire. And so then I was asked to come into the role in the mayor's office for safe and healthy neighborhoods to oversee development of a strategy for the city because we were literally on fire, but also to help the conversation, right? Because what we were experiencing as a city had a lot to do with structural violence. And so even though everybody wanted to talk about the direct violence that was happening, right? Nobody wanted to hear the mayor talk about don't be violent when, this woman was just murdered and we're just sitting here. How do you, again, bridge this gap between community wanting to tear the government down and set it on fire? And also while the city is being set on fire, talk about it in a way that folks can digest and recognize that maybe you understand, right, the pain of the moment. That was a difficult season, especially when you're building out an office that doesn't have many resources, because we know how OVPs or offices for neighborhood safety are funded. And so that became my charge to build the funding arm of the work so that we could actually see results. That's exactly what I did in the time that I was there. And then from there, I am now where I am now, which is CEO, Executive Director at Cure Violence Global.
So, yeah, this is exactly why I wanted to have you on the show, because first off, you're connecting a lot of dots with previous guests on the show. One, Beverly Kingston, who's the director of Centers of Excellence Youth Violence Prevention here in Colorado. I've had her on the show to talk about what it looks like to have a university partner with community violence, youth violence prevention work, and the importance of the universities providing and provisioning resources that they have in order for communities and implement and then evaluate their efforts and using that scientific model of public health. I am also a huge fan of approaching violence from a public health lens, knowing that it is both communicable and it's a preventable disease, right? And I think you spoke to this. When we look at marginalized communities and their health outcomes, and that's not even just their physical health outcomes. So we talk about their economic health. We talk about their educational health. We talk about their social emotional health. All of these things are struggling in those marginalized communities. And COVID really showed us that there are structural, institutional root causes that are intentionally, or at least have been intentionally. Now, I think now we're making more of an effort to address or redress those, but this isn't by accident. That structures were built in order for those inequities to exist. I'll just say it that way. If you look at the communities across the country that have those higher instances and disproportionate higher instances of violence, of poverty, of low educational attainment rates, those were the same zip codes that you saw disproportionate rates of COVID infections and deaths. Thank you for helping me share that picture with anyone listening. There was a couple things you said, and I want to circle back to. But before we go there, can you talk about your role now as the director of Cure Violence Global? Can you talk more about what Cure Violence Global is, the approach that Cure Violence takes to violence prevention and intervention, and what is your role as the director of that?
Oh, what is my role? What is in my role? So right, Cure Violence, right? I call it the legacy organization. So we're like a founding organization in what is like the movement that we see now of understanding how to address violence through a public health intervention. We've had the knowledge that violence is a public health issue since forever, right? Like that first declaration may have been, was that 80s, 70s, right? And so it's like there's research, there's kind of this understanding of the connectivity of violence as a public health issue, but the building out of an actual like scientific intervention for violence using public health methodology started from this organization. And so it takes that epidemiological lens of, in the same way that we would treat TB, the same way we treated cholera, the same way we treated the pandemic, right? There are steps that you take to interrupt the transmission of an infectious disease. And you can apply those same steps and processes to interrupting the transmission of violence. And they kind of piloted this notion in West Garfield Park, which at the time was one of the most violent communities in the US. And in that first year, saw at least a 60% reduction in shootings in that neighborhood. And so it just continued to build and grow. And it saw a lot of success, not just here in Chicago, but then being asked to come to other cities around the US and other countries around the world. And at this point, even, the methodology being applied to different kinds of violence. In the US, we see a lot of the community gang group related violence being addressed by the methodology. But a lot of our work in Latin America, you see gender-based violence and human trafficking kinds of things. And the methodology is working for that. Some of the work, that was done a few years ago in Africa, we were in Nigeria, and you're talking about, the herders and the graders in their tensions, but using the methodology to address that kind of violence. We've been in Israel, we've been in the West Bank before, and you're talking about that kind of terroristic war kinds of violence and seeing reductions in conflicts with this strategy. And so there shouldn't be a notion in anybody's mind that you shouldn't be using this kind of approach in some shape, way, or form to address violence in whatever municipality you're in. And it's not like it's the only thing that needs to happen by a long shot. I just talked about 3 different kinds of violence. You could probably utilize this strategy to address those kinds of violence too. But that's a longer conversation. Even within this, we know that utilizing violence interrupters, street outreach workers to engage with the folks who are at the highest risk of, who have been placed at the highest risk of becoming perpetrators and or victims of violence, utilizing these kind of parahealth professionals to build relationship with those individuals and interrupt whatever the conflicts are or mediate conflicts, deal with them about how they're thinking about violence and how they behave in relation to violence to kind of reduce the likelihood of them continuing to be violent. It's very hard work, as you know personally yourself, but it's very effective work. So that's who we are and what we do. My job is to continue to lead the organization, but really to help continue to advocate for violence as a public health issue, sharing the benefits of why it's important for us to continue to consistently pour resources into the work that is this growing field of CVI at the moment.
Thank you for sharing all that, and particularly your closing piece of continually and consistently putting resources into this approach. Again, as I have progressed through my career path and gotten to a space where I'm looking more and more at the bigger picture and recognizing the root causes, the consistent root causes of violence and who's involved and impacted, it's becoming more and more clear to me that when we talk about policy from the legislation, that needs to be at least a two-pronged approach. We need to pour investments into the people on the ground who are working. I love the phrase parahealth professionals. I love that phrase. I'm stealing it, so thank you. But the people who are doing the really difficult and oftentimes dangerous work of being in communities, looking to interrupt these conflicts, helping provide services and mentorship and all of the things that we need for them to provide for the behavior change that steers people away from the violent culture. And track number 2, and it's not in order of importance, but the second track is also investing in those upstream conditions, improvement of those, whether it's housing opportunities and instability, food security, upward economic mobility opportunities through employment, quality education, equitably quality education, healthcare, all of those things that we know are disproportionately inequitable in these communities that make them vulnerable. That's literally what makes them vulnerable, because they don't have these things. So thank you. Thank you for pointing all that out. And I'm glad that fake care violence is leading that conversation and elevating that conversation of this public health approach. I want to dig into, when you laid out the different types of violence that communities are experiencing, the cultural, structural, and direct violence. Can you talk a bit more about what differentiates those types of violence and how does it show up in communities?
How does this show?
Yeah.
I mean, it shows up in many ways, right? And so a lot of times, like the narrative around what violence is and how it should address it, it falls under kind of one of two categories, right? People talk about self-directed violence or interpersonal violence, right? And so self-direct violence, when somebody hurts themselves, right? Or the interpersonal violence is all of the other stuff that we're used to seeing. Somebody hurts somebody else in whatever shape, way, or form. And these types of violence are easily seen. You know, there's a very clear perpetrator. There's a very clear victim. Well, we don't even have to talk about the definition of violence that everybody kind of uses. Well, maybe I will, right? Like, so
Yeah,
a
go
lot
ahead.
of times we use the World Health Organization's definition of violence, which is the intentional use of physical force or power, threatened or actual, against oneself, another person, or a group community that either results in or has a high likelihood of resulting in injury, death, harm, maldevelopment, or deprivation. So then you say, okay, well, when people hear that definition, I think there are things that they overlook even about what that definition says. There are particular parts of it that you don't always pay attention to, specifically that word power, and seeing violence as the use of power, threatened or actual, against people, right? That ends in morbidity or mortality. That original definition also says the word intentional, the intentional use of physical force or power. But I would also argue that violence can sometimes be unintentionally, particularly when it's embedded in systems and institutions by design and then facilitated on a daily without a conscious awareness that like violence is even happening.
Yeah.
And that's when you get into like the whole element of structural violence. And if we talk about what structural violence is in its simplest definition, is literally like any system or institution that is intentionally keeping folks from meeting their basic needs. And then when you talk about cultural violence, right, it's any kind of social norm or ideology that exists that allows for either type of violence to be, right? So for racism to exist, there had to be a culture that allowed for racism to exist. There was a belief that, you know, Black people were inferior, that we should be, right, sold in chattel slavery, right?
Yeah.
That was the societal norm. That was the law. It was the way of being, right? So even how cultural violence and the way people think and our societal norms affect the policies that we create. And then on the other side of kind of the direct violence that we see in community, we also know that in our communities, there is a culture of violence that is established. And there is a code essentially that calls for violence sometimes to be the response depending on what has happened. And if you don't respond in that way, then you yourself could be in danger, right? You then may make yourself a target
Oh,
because you didn't respond in the way that has been standardized by the subculture of your space. And so all of these things have to be considered when you're talking about building out a strategy to address violence. And one of the things that we would take people through in our center when we were trying to help them see the connectivity between structural violence and the outcome of youth violence, right? And so if you start with structural violence and you say structural violence, right, racism, that's structural violence, right? So then structural violence created policies and practices that maintain oppression, right? So what is a policy practice that maintained oppression? Well, we can look at redlining as that policy, right? And so then what did redlining do? Well, You created community conditions that increase the risk of violence, right? And what was that? Well, that was the creation of that concentrated poverty caused by redlining, right? And so in communities, then what was created? Well, then you now have family conditions that increase the risk of violence. What are the family conditions that increase the risk of violence? Now you're talking about resource deprivation for those families that exist in those communities that now are in this place of concentrated poverty. When you go one step over and you look maybe from an individual perspective, you have that interpersonal thing that's happening. And so you have
Mm-hmm.
interpersonal conditions that increase the risk of violence. What is that? That looks like competition because now people are competing for limited resources. So then at the individual level, you are increasing the likelihood of there being characteristics that lead to the engagement in violent behavior because people are essentially just trying to survive. And so then you have an outcome that is a form of direct violence for all of these other reasons. Our start in the violence prevention research was always on the individual and how you change the individual and you change the
Right.
individual's behavior. And all of that is important. It's the work that we do because at the end of the day, the conditions have been created. The environment is there. The petri dish has been made. It's growing. And there has to be a strategy for the right now. That's that public health epidemiology thing that we're doing. We are interrupting the transmission of what's happening here. We are isolating the cases, right? And we are treating the people. But if you don't go upstream, you're always going to be here with the petri dish of the created conditions. And even in the example that I gave, you can replace that with multiple policies that stemmed from the creation of the norm in America that it was okay to treat Black and brown people and less than. It was okay to divest in those communities. It was okay to be unfair and unethical in the establishment of redlining and what that did to our communities. So there are several steps upstream that need some attention too.
You just gave a whole master class on the difference between what racism, what sexism, what capitalism is a vehicle that does more than hurts a person's feelings, but really impacts somebody's chances for success.
Absolutely.
It's me personally, but I get a bit bothered, maybe that's too strong of a word, when I see people refer to bigotry and like memes or somebody calling somebody out of a name and using a racial slur or whatever as that person's racist. It's like actually is not. And I hate to be that actually person, but there's no power in that, right? It's a society that allows and supports that behavior. And then, yeah, as you're talking about, like on a whole other level, racism, capitalism, sexism are the policies, practices, philosophies, principles that protect people of privilege, right? And that's where we need to focus our efforts to make sure that we're changing status quo. And as you were explaining it out, I was thinking of a Russian nesting doll, right? You open it up and there's a smaller doll, and you open it up and there's a smaller one. You're focusing on something so micro that you're never going to impact change as long as the larger doll that holds all of this in one space still exists. So thank you for doing that. My next question is, let's pretend that I am a mayor or I'm the city manager or even I would say maybe even better, the director of public safety for a city. How do I go about making sure that public health is informing or at least involved in my violence prevention strategy?
Well, be looping your public health professional, your health department, who is already operating in like the vein of public health. When we started, we were in the health department, the Office for Safety and Healthy Neighborhoods in Louisville. Started in the health department to be surrounded by and have access to the resources of the health department. But then it was moved to the mayor's office because it became very political. Public safety always is. And when you don't have people that are bought in or understand this kind of alternative strategy for public safety, a lot of times it feels like a threat. And so get your local public health professionals involved and then leverage and bring in the expertise of the folks who have experience with applying a public health approach to the issue of violence and crime. At this stage, there's no limitation of access to information and individuals who can support that type of effort. Before, not so much. But now, I mean, there's so much information. And I would say don't just use information, because then you have people who do that and then they try to implement on their own without the expertise in the room. And so I wouldn't recommend that. But yeah, get the support, the technical assistance that you need to help ensure that what you're doing is accurate.
You spoke to, I think the heart of my question is, for so long, society, I'm going to assume good intentions in this, that for so long we have, as a society, as an American society, maybe even globally, assumed that the cure, no pun intended, to violence is public safety, right? Is law enforcement, is incarceration, is arrest. And because it has become the standard, like you said, there are people who work in public safety who become threatened when you start to have a conversation about implementing a public health approach. What I'm asking, forgive me if I'm putting you on the spot in this, what I'm asking is, how do we start to get them to feel not so threatened and more cooperative and see the bigger picture of they are also a part of this process?
So to me, this sounds like large scale behavior change. And in this, you see the power of narrative, you see the power of ideology, you see the power of theory. And I know that I am a scientist by trade. And so some of that just is always on my brain, because it's like in theory and we build strategy from theory. But even if you look at a lot of the theorists or Western theology, you get an understanding of why we're framed the way that we're framed, but you also see the significance of information and education. And so there would have to be some large scale, I won't even say public health campaign, but even health campaign relative to violence that is targeted for certain populations to help them understand certain information. It would probably have to be done over time. Now, with that also, I would couple in the same way that it is important for the credible messages on the ground, for the outreach workers, for the VI, folks that are connecting with those who have been placed at the highest risk for violent engagement. It's important for the individuals to be credible and relatable and have the ability to build relationships with these folks, because there's almost something that's already there that they trust, right?
Mm-hmm.
These other people who have these other ways of thinking about public safety, their transformation have to come in the same way. Like it almost has to come from someone that they're familiar with, right? A police officer is going to listen to another police officer before he listens to maybe something that I have to say, unless I have a different type of relationship with them. But even if I do, there's still something that you're going to listen to from your kind of comrade, colleague, because you feel like your experiences are similar enough that they understand what you're going through and why you think the way that you think. And so how do we even utilize this strategy? Doesn't just have to work for this kind of violence. This strategy can also work for structural violence, where you're talking about, we just used to call it get your people. When we bring everybody to the table and you have folks at the table that are the allies, and if they're not going to listen to me yell till I'm blue in the face about racism because like I'm technically not their people, you're their people, ally at the table, like get your people. You know what they need to hear. You know what they're going to be more susceptible to hearing from you. You probably have an idea of why they think the way that they think already, and the strategies that you're going to have to employ to get them to start thinking differently, and the activities that you might have to engage with them in to expose them to something different, right? And so how much of that kind of strategy is happening on that end?
I love what you just said about the whole credible messenger model, how it applies to the boots on the ground out there in the trenches, doing the work all the way up the ladder. Because honestly, that's the philosophy and the theory behind this show, is bringing people who are credible messengers to their people in other spaces across the country to hear the conversation that we're having. I would offer this, that it's people like you and me, people like Anthony, people like other guests on the show who have served in the roles that we have served in and developed the relationships with directors of safety and police chief, all of those folks, to say with good assumption that I have given you no reason not to trust me. So as I advocate for this approach and this philosophy of public health, that you consider it and see the benefits in it, as I'm not just going to bring you any bullshit. Excuse me. I'm not going to bring you any bullshit because this is my community. I'm also speaking on behalf of my community as a credible messenger. So thank you for helping even frame that. One other piece that you mentioned that I want to touch on is the importance of bringing young people and youth and involving them in the process. I know a lot of people say we need youth involved in the process and don't necessarily know what that means, how to do it. And I would even say how to support the youth, the young people, so that they're successful in being a part of the process. Do you have, like, what has been your experience in bringing youth to the table and involving them in the process?
This will put me on a soapbox, so I'm going to be
Please
real
do.
careful, because people don't even understand, or this is one of those areas where even the science of youth development is not respected. And you have people who like young people, and just because they like young people and maybe they like to be around them, then they all of a sudden know what should be done or how it should be done for young people. And, there's a lot of times this kind of tokenism that happens amongst young people, right? Like, oh, you have a young person, so like that's the youth representative. But even within youth, right, they're not a monolith either, and then you're talking about youth who are impacted by violence. And then even if you're talking about youth who are directly impacted by violence, there are differences in that direct impact, right? Whether you are someone who has been violent yourself, whether you have been hurt by violence, like your physical body, whether your family member has been hurt by violence, whether you saw an instance of violence, right? Like, so there's all kinds of stuff. And then the identification that the needs of the varying type of young people are different as well when you're talking about engaging them in different processes. And so I would first always urge that you have somebody that has some experience or knowledge in youth development. And then somebody who has knowledge and experience with dealing with different kinds of youth. The issue literally becomes that with this kind of work, a lot of times when you're talking about building strategy for community, you get the youth who are engaged. You get the youth who want to be there because they want the community service hours, or, they're already in the Black Achievers program, or this or that, the honor roll student, right? And so, I mean, it's personal to me because this is what we were looking at within our own intervention in our center. And if you had the accolades, you were actually like X'd out of the process. We wanted the young people who were doing the things, right, to be engaged in this process to see how that impacted, their engagement in violence or how they showed up in their communities. And we were taught some hard lessons. I still do like kind of brown bag lunch today with the CDC because they'll tell us, and I'll take it, that we had some of the best engagement strategies for the particular population. But with that, it's hard to stay on a timeline with a grant
You
or
better
anything
preach.
else when you're talking about engaging this population, because they don't always just show up ready to work. And there are other things that you have to deal with, right? One young lady, she had an attitude anyway, but we knew that. But one day she came in and she wasn't doing any work, and she was just sitting at her desk, and she had an attitude with everybody, right? But she was there, but the attitude was just a little higher than normal, right? And so she was very close with one of my program coordinators. And we found out that her best friend had been shot the night before. She was with her best friend. Her best friend died. She went to school the next day. Now she's sitting at work. What do you want her to do? What should she be doing? Right. So then we learned quickly that even in our intervention, we needed mental health and trauma support in our space. And so we had to build that into our intervention. And then they don't want to hear the word therapy, right? So they even renamed the sessions that we created for them to have with these people. And we would step out and let them do their thing. That's a process. They couldn't come into our space with weapons, but that didn't mean that they didn't toss their weapons in different spaces because they still had to go home. Or the times when you knew something was hot. So it was like, I have to stay here longer because then I have to take you home because it's not going to be safe for you to walk home, especially after what you just told me. Then you have to deal with parents and all of these other things. Sometimes I couldn't even work, or I have to sit here for 3 hours because he was chased on his way into work today. And so if I don't let him and get all of this out in this space that he considers safe, I don't know what that could turn into when he leaves, right? So I lost 3 hours of my workday, and you just sat here so that you could woosah and feel good enough to not be violent when you left here, right? And so these are the things that you cannot account for completely ahead of time when you're building strategies specifically for a population of individuals that have been traumatized, that are living in trauma, and you are spoon feeding intervention somewhat to help, but they're also still going back into a toxic environment space. And so then what are you doing on all of these other fronts so that they can show up into your space and, give you the very valid insight that you need? Because I'll tell you, one of our guys who, he was in and out of jail a few times, and that tapered off as he more so engaged with us. He was one of the best interviewers ever. He could get other kids to tell him things that they would never tell me, right? I'm a researcher, I know strategy, but again, that relationship, we taught him strategy. Best thing we could have ever done, right? So now we're equipping them with these different kinds of skills that they wouldn't get, and they're becoming better for the things that they're being exposed to. But we had to take into consideration a lot of their context, and that just doesn't happen a lot of times in youth intervention spaces. That's where people just have to be realistic about what they actually want. Do you want the ones who are on the edge, or do you just want an intervention to be complete?
I really hope that people are watching this video right now, because I'm doing my best not to be like jumping up in church and clapping and like, amen, like your amen corner, because you just gave a whole sermon that people need to hear. I I observe it time and time again when people say we have community-based organization that it's youth-based or it's youth-led or, the language. But to use your phrase, oftentimes the youth participation is tokenized. And especially when we talk about whether it's substance misuse, whether it's violence, whether it's, whatever it may be, and they say we want youth participation and youth input. The easy way to go about that is to get the high functioning youth, the ones who are a part of the clubs. In this violent space, there are youth organizations, I will not call them out specifically, that are branches of larger nationwide advocacy organizations. And they tend to show up in spaces advocating for youth violence prevention, youth gun violence prevention, but they're only parroting the talking points of the adult-led organizations. And these are, again, the honor roll students, the ones who are in the AP classes, the ones who know being a part of this particular student organization is going to look great on a college admission application. Right. Whereas the kids who are experiencing violence on a daily basis part of the reason that they may be impacted by the violence is because they know they're probably not going to go to college, or it's not even within their thought structure of, when I finish high school, this is what I'm doing. I'm just here surviving. And they're
Right.
excluded from the conversation. So I'm right there on the soapbox with you. Thank you for making room. This conversation, I've said it before, this has been just as impactful, and I'll use this word again, reaffirming for me personally. I think that anyone who is listening to this episode who wants to learn more about the big picture and how to affect change in the different components of the big picture of violence prevention will learn a lot from this episode. I hope to have you back on the show if you will be okay with that, because there's a lot of pieces that I want to even just a lot of what you talked about, like dig more specifically into that. The other piece is there are some young people, some young women who have been a part of the work here with the local Center for Youth Violence Prevention, who I think would just love to meet you. And they last week during Youth Violence Prevention Week, they gave a fantastic presentation on risk factors. And I just felt like that proud grandpa sitting in the back, like, go ahead, baby. And for them to be able to see you as a Black woman, as a leader in this space, I think that it would be really beneficial for them to connect with you if you're okay with that. So
Absolutely.
The show is called The Credible Messenger. I reached out to you specifically because I view you as a credible messenger in many spaces, whether it's to the community or it's to administrators and policymakers and decision makers, and like even just now talking about with young people who are on this career path. I admire and respect your work and what you have done and what you are doing. And so as a credible messenger, I want to give you this opportunity to share what is a message that you want to leave the audience with.
I'll just say, we're in a pivotal season, right? When you talk about the way kind of violence is being experienced, and over the last few years, the kind of mobilizing of resources and efforts to address it, it doesn't have to be bleak, right? When you look at what we know and understand about violence, while multifaceted and it requires multiple sectors to be involved, it really is simple, right? Like you can look at the communities that are struggling, and then you can look at the communities that are thriving and do what's here that's not here, Or do we build equity into these spaces that have traditionally been inequitable, right? Not an easy work, but strategies are still simple. And that gives me hope, right? And it's the thing that continues to propel me forward in the work, that there is hope. And so I just leave with that. There is hope. When you're in this work, it can be easy sometimes to even become apathetic, but there is hope.
Thank you. That was honestly, this conversation was on the verge of uncomfortable because I felt like you were looking in my soul. This lady, she knows me too well. She knows my experience, but I also share that outlook and understand that perspective. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
I thank you for just helping me elevate the moment. To my audience, if you made it this far, you are also confirming and reaffirming everything I just said, that this has been a productive, beneficial, valuable use of your time. This conversation has been packed with so many jewels. And so I thank you. I thank you for listening to the show. And I ask a favor of you, as I do every week, to share this with your colleagues, your counterparts, anyone within your community who will also see the value in this conversation. The goal is to build a community of people who are committed and knowledgeable enough to implement changes where they are, wherever they are. with that said, I appreciate you, and we will be back next week with another credible messenger.